In fact, I would say it's kind of like, imagine if somebody was going and making a remake of Mass Effect, and then somehow, by some bizarre logic, they ended up assigning this to two different teams. One of those teams ended up coming out with XCOM Long War, which would be One Vision, and then the other came out with Bloodborne, which would be Reborn there. Where they technically both created amazing things, but what the fuck, they went in totally different directions. Hello, folks, and good morning. Welcome to an answer to a question that I'm hoping won't cause much contention here. So, for those that are just joining us in this awesome series, you may have potentially been brought to a question, namely, which version of Tactics Ogre Let Us Cling Together do you start with? Generally speaking, it's kind of considered common knowledge that the oldest one is... they tried their best. The PSP version is, similarly, they tried a bit more than their best and may have potentially been doing a bit of cocaine trying to add all those features in there. And then we have the two definitive versions in the form of Reborn, the official version, and then One Vision, the unofficial mod version. So, what's the deal? How did we wind up with two definitive versions, and which one should you go for? Now, I'm going to go ahead and just kind of skip straight to the eventual answer here, just in case anybody has the attention span of a gnat, but just so you know, if you're getting into this series thinking that you're only going to play it once, you're not getting the full experience here. Because, unlike many other games, this is... so, when folks look at Tactics Ogre, in many cases they'll compare it with like a Fire Emblem or a Final Fantasy Tactics or something like that, especially due to the fact that it was the creator of Final Fantasy Tactics that was behind this one as well. And in many cases they'll go and look at it and be like, oh, it's just the same thing with different combat mechanics. I recognize this story and writing and whatever else, but that's the thing. Tactics Ogre does stuff a little bit differently. In fact, in many ways, mechanically, it's closer to something like a Fallout or a Mass Effect than it is to a Final Fantasy Tactics. One of the biggest things about this game is its replayability. The fact that every time you play through, different stuff will end up happening. Different people will live, die, lie to each other, what have you, and the story will adapt to every one of those situations. Yes, even the SNES version, they've been doing it for that long, sitting there being a completely unsung thing. Likely why that old Kickstarter thing, that unsung story thing was called that. Anyway, so it is ridiculously ambitious in terms of how many variations of different things end up happening over the course of the story. So, for all intents and purposes here, just doing one playthrough is not going to give you the full story of anything here. So, what we have are these two versions in front of us here, and just so you know, they both will, functionally speaking, have more or less the same story. Over on the Reborn side, we have some updated stuff in terms of things having different requirements for different units. Like, for example, Deneb is a hidden character that's very difficult to recruit, but far easier to do in Reborn, whereas whereas One Vision has that done through a completely different means by making her required items a bit easier to get a hold of in bulk. But either way, they both had that same idea of like, you know, here's this character that's annoying to recruit, let's go ahead and fix that. They went about it in different ways, but this can also be said for basically everything about them. See, when it comes to both of these, they very clearly understood the assignment. The thing was that the tools that they had on hand, as well as their kind of personal approaches, were very different. On the One Vision side of things, this was handled by Rakes, and he's actually still working on the mod, over the course of, I think it's going on like 6 or 7 years at this point. It's been around for a really damn long time, and you know, there's been lots of community input, there's been lots of feedback, there's been a lot of formulating the overall system, but the focus was largely on consistency. Essentially, in the original game, like when we took a look at the equipment, in many cases those pieces of gear would be all over the place. You'd have like one random knife that just gave you a huge increase in your intelligence, but then it just sucked for offense, and this other one over here might just give you a huge, you know, boost in strength or something, and it made your luck worse. Like, it was a complete kind of grab bag of all kinds of different little bits and pieces all over the place. So essentially, when they were going and looking into making the One Vision mod, what they had done was that they had gone through and they made a lot of the categories more, I guess you could say, MMO-esque. Where, for example, your primary weapons are going to fall into particular categories, and they will be straight upgrades of each other, but then at the same time you have unique variants that are going to show up for all of your different weapon types. Over on the Reborn side of things, on the newer side of things, they went about it in essentially doubling down on the original version, where you've got a lot more kind of chaos to a lot of your equipment, but they made it so that that equipment lasts longer. For example, let's say early in Chapter 2, and just so you know, for the sake of context, there's effectively 8 chapters, even though officially there's 4. We'll get to that maybe, or we won't. It's a long-ass game, just so you know. If you decide to go for all the post-game content, good lord, you're going to be here a while. Anyway, fairly early on, I know Chapter 2 sounds like it's halfway through the story. It's closer to like a third. But either way, around that time, you end up getting a hold of the False Strike Cutlass, right? And so you have both a Rapier and a Cutlass that are going to give you the False Strike ability, which means that when they hit, there's a chance to reduce the enemy's accuracy. Now, this has completely different meanings in both of these games. For example, in the original PSP version, this meant that you had a weapon that was good at inflicting a debuff conveniently for a little bit, but its overall lack of power meant that it fell off by the endgame. So when it was then remade, when it came to Reborn, they made it so that the strength of the unit itself mattered more than the lack of relative strength on the weapon, which made the situation that that these weapons were still functional into the later sections of the game. And potentially you might even consider, downgrading your equipment in order to be a little bit faster or something along those lines. There was a whole lot of stuff like that, where stuff that seemed like it would be a simple decision ended up being a lot more kind of complex once you got right down to it, So, like, again, same thing with the Claymore and Zweihander there, where technically the Zweihander is a bit weaker, but due to the fact that it's a decent bit less weight, it might be more worthwhile if all you're looking for is a weapon that inflicts breach, as well as another debuff when you're using it. Anyway, we'll go ahead and go off that topic because you probably don't know how good debuffs are as of yet. So, with that all being said, what's the deal here? So, like, in One Vision, what they would do is they would take those pieces of equipment, and they would say, okay, they're all a category now. So, like, let's say we go over to the fist weapons, and there would be a category of fists that just inflicted stun, or all of the claws would be inflicting poison. But then later on down the road, there would be other ones that would be inflicting, like, let's say, MP damage as a secondary effect to their attack. There was a big focus on kind of creating an even playing field of different strategic options. So rather than one thing getting weaker over time, they all remained relatively strong, So either way, that was a big focus of the mod there, to just retain consistency from start to finish. Whereas Reborn leaned more into this kind of feeling of bringing stuff back from the past and kind of constantly recontextualizing stuff. So I'll actually go ahead and switch one thing real quick on the Reborn screen, because we just lost a character that I don't feel like losing. So let's go. Actually, this is probably a good way to potentially describe some of this stuff as well. Just to give you an idea over the kind of different mindsets going into these two different mods. So, like, in the Reborn version, like you saw, they're going to have different categories of different weapons, different equipment that are going to fulfill the same role as you go through it. Reborn's approach is more a case of having stable kind of items that will kind of serve a different role as you go along. So, like, let's say you're later on in Chapter 4 and you discover that you can craft a Dragon Fang. This is a dagger that's going to be associated with an earth element. It's going to have a decent amount of attack value to it, has an anti-dragon bonus, has a poison cloud effect, and has the ability to poison on hit. And mechanically, this can mean a lot of things. Just so you understand, there's a lot of mechanics to this game. There's a lot of little tiny stuff that can just kind of completely change the strategic situation on the fly. So, let's say right over here, she's got 2 daggers that can poison, she's got a double attack over here, she's got essentially a shielding ability, and she's got this ability right here. This ability will allow her to hit with 100% accuracy and score a critical, which is great, but you may have noticed earlier that in her particular case, she's essentially already going to be hitting with 100%, so what's the point? Well, if it says that it's 100%, this means that it also guarantees the debuff on that hit. So now, she can be a unit that will pretty much guarantee that she'll go and inflict poison with every one of her attacks. Okay, that would be pretty handy. So we'll just go ahead and switch over to that for the moment. Bear in mind that some of this stuff will make no sense out of context, just roll with it. But anyways, the idea is that that dagger, when you end up getting it, feels like a super powerful weapon because it's probably stronger than whatever generic garbage you've been running around with up to that point. But then as soon as you're getting into the later game there, then you might notice, like, hey, if I give this to a caster, that suddenly means that their magic that they were using, this Poison Cloud over here, became free because the weapon can cast it for them. Or in other cases, let's say they were exploring around and they realized, like, okay, I now, let's say, need to go hit a lightning affiliated unit. That means that dagger will be doing more versus them. But then you realize, hey, if I can get this Dragon Slayer ability by combining multiple pieces of equipment, that's pretty interesting. And so you put all those pieces of equipment on there, combines with that 20% bonus on that knife, and suddenly this knife is capable of one-shotting dragons. Like, the idea is that every piece of equipment is just another piece of the puzzle. And bear in mind, again, in both versions you will have a variation of this. In One Vision's case, there's a bigger focus on this sort of like churning battlefield feeling. This idea that everyone's got multiple tools on hand, like an absolute ton of tools on hand, and you're looking for those little breakthroughs that'll end up kind of changing the fight there. Like, where, like, let's say we have clerics on that team that are going to have poisoned claws. So if something attacks that cleric, there's a decent chance that they'll inflict a poison, which may potentially cause a disruption to their, healing support on the other side, which might mean that it saves you a little bit of time and you can potentially push through that opening. So the focus is on those like little moments of trying to sort of pry the metaphorical grate out of the wall. Like looking for those little openings using whatever tools you have on hand. Over in Reborn's case, there's a bigger focus on flow, where in general, as you may have noticed, the reason that I'm playing this music in the background is that it feels like an old Sonic game to actually play, where the fights are just constantly just like going and going and going and going, and I would snap my fingers, except my fingers all dry and cracked, and that just made my friggin' thumb bleed. Ow. Anyway, pretend there's snapping, but it just keeps on going and going and going. There's an emphasis on, like, okay, you turn on your elemental bars, you know who's going to be strong against who, you know how to utilize your debuffs, you know what your units are good at, and so you're constantly twisting these tools to very quickly achieve breakthroughs. So the overall mood and feel of the types of strategy that they're trying to achieve are entirely different, but they both improve on the original in very fascinating ways. They all vastly stretch out the options that were there in more interesting ways. Again, in Reborn's case, it was entirely about recontextualization. In One Vision, it was about evolving the mechanics that were already there into something completely fresh. Like, let's say you have the elemental shield system that wasn't really much to talk about in the PSP version, where they were a spell that would make you slightly resistant to a particular element. And frankly, it was never really worth ever wasting a turn to go and deploy it. You were better off just increasing your overall resistance with just a resistance item. There was very little reason to ever consider it. So in both cases, they took completely different approaches that sound very similar on paper. In One Vision, the way that they handled it was that they took what's considered a sort of like low-tier buff or debuff. So like, let's say you have your weakens, your strengthens, your fortifies, that kind of stuff, and whenever applying that buff from that particular elemental kind of school there, you will then end up getting that same element resisted, right? So that's very handy. It means that you suddenly will have this resistance that you weren't expecting, and it's just kind of there. There's a lot of buffs and debuffs flying around in One Vision. And it can be a bit chaotic, it can be a bit overwhelming for new players, but for the long-timers, it is an absolute dream of chaos. Like, you just see this absolute flood of complete craziness on the field, and it's like, yes, I'm looking forward to analyzing this for the next half a damn hour. Whereas on Reborn, you may have noticed that, technically speaking, there are still debuffs flying around, but they're from more predictable places. So, for example, the casters will no longer cast debuffs. They can, if you choose to do so, but they changed it so that all units have the ability to crit with just about every single type of action that they do, creating more kind of momentum on the overall field, where, like, let's say a wizard casts a gigantic fire tornado in the middle of a crowd, and if they had any kind of crit buildup up to that point, they would spread units around all over the place, potentially throwing multiple units off walls into death pits, what have you. It becomes absolute chaos, but it's very immediate. Whereas if you choose to go down the debuff route, you can absolutely set up for that yourself. So this leads to a very, very, again, active feeling. Reborn feels very active. And because of all of this, the focus of Reborn was again about speed, about getting everyone into this rhythm of clearing maps and quickly countering things, coming up with effective builds with technically fewer options with more context behind them. So, like, let's say, whereas like One Vision would end up giving you, let's say, 20 or 30 different options on your list. Usually this came down to a completely different context for Reborn, where they would say, okay, here's multiple existing things combined in a weird way. Like I was mentioning earlier with those elemental shields, their take on it was the automatic system, where there were multiple skills that were made to automatically function at the start of your turn. They had a chance to activate, and whether or not you picked up some of those cards with an S on it along the way, those odds to activate went up by 30%. This effectively meant that anything automatic could become permanent. The overall context for this was really interesting, because it meant that you regularly would have these cases where you would get into fights and everything would just keep flowing and flowing and flowing and flowing. And what they did with those shields is that you would essentially have different contexts for all of those different shields. I know I'm rambling a little bit, I apologize, I do that sometimes. But like, let's say a unit is air, right? And so they put on a Instill Ice. They combined what was the Instill ability and the shield ability. So now you are getting both offense and defense from that one ability. It triggers automatically at the start of your turn and has a chance to trigger at the start of every turn. Now, your relation to that element, as well as the opponent's relation to that element, would change how well any of those things functioned. So, for example, if a unit were to hit you with the element that you were weak against, and that shield was active, it would defend you against it. If you were, for example, to match your offensive element, it would suddenly jump in the case where essentially you are both strong against the opposing unit. Or, for example, if it goes half and half, it's everything in between is also covered. There's a lot of these little nuances to all of this stuff that suddenly matter a lot more. See, they stretched out the numbers between the two different versions. In Reborn, the health bars are technically much larger, the numbers being hit are a lot larger, crits are suddenly allowed for just about every action, and every action can be multiplied a lot easier. See, back in the PSP version, which is also what One Vision uses, there was a big emphasis on ranks. So let me show you real quick. So every unit on the field would have ranks associated with skills that could go up. Like this unit over here will be using Dark Magic, so they have an Augment Darkness. Every time that they cast anything that will check this skill, it will improve a little bit. This goes up to a maximum of 8 and can potentially be overranked by combining equipment that will match it. So, this creates a very kind of in-the-spreadsheet type of system, where potentially you'll be going specifically for certain types of equipment in order to boost those kinds of abilities to be able to punch past defenses. Because your ability to improve your weapon rank and improve your augments as well as your racial skills, which are less of a thing in One Vision, basically combining 3 stacks of this whole thing in the original PSP version would just easily steamroll you through the entire game, so they kind of toned it down a little bit for One Vision. Anyway, so what it creates is this system where there is a focus on defensive penetration, where once you get a unit towards a particular breaking point, let's say you give them a heavy weapon, you give them their respective augment, you give them their weapon skill, you train them up a little bit, and then suddenly you'll see those moments where they go from dealing what would be considered normal damage to completely punching past an enemy unit, which is pretty cool. It feels pretty good to accomplish this. Now, Reborn essentially re-envisioned this whole thing, where everyone still technically has a weapon rank associated with them. However, they ended up changing it so that those weapon ranks are not only more gradual, but they're also capped off at a certain point. So this means that there's a level cap system in place. This oftentimes is misunderstood. Mostly what this means is that you will be exactly where you need to be to ever get past this game at any given point. This Reborn is essentially built in such a way that there's a far bigger emphasis on kind of skillful play rather than ever grinding. And granted, Reborn, or not Reborn, but One Vision also goes down that particular route. That's one of those things that makes these two so difficult to compare, because technically speaking, they both do it in their own ways, and it's like as soon as you say it for one, it's also kind of true for the other, and again, it's just difficult to compare the two side by side like this. So, with that all being said, if we continue on here, we'll see that when it comes to those particular units, essentially this means that they will be paced out a lot better. You don't get access to skills earlier than you should. You don't suddenly get access to super overpowered abilities. You don't get to just sit there and grind your way past all your problems. I should mention One Vision's approach to all of this, from what I understand here, is that they've... I say from what I understand because a lot of things have changed in terms of how the game transitions into the post-game, but there's a lot more difficulty from the AI itself. Just simply over-leveling it will not necessarily be what you need in order to actually accomplish a win. You need to constantly be thinking about how to rebuild your people, to make up for small weaknesses, to potentially turn them into strengths, to potentially turn them into counters, to just kind of create an entire machine out of your soldiers. So the focus is on having them constantly support each other through like buffs, through small regeneration abilities, through breaking down enemies with debuffs. There's a big focus on holding lines. What's funny is in Reborn's case, the focus was more along the lines of... let's go ahead and switch this guy to AI real quick. The focus was more... Again, it's similar in description, where there's a bigger focus on synergy and teamwork, technically between the two. Not in terms of like one ability will support another, but in terms of having constant coverage for everything. And in fact, I would say it's kind of like, imagine if somebody was going and making a remake of Mass Effect, and then somehow, by some bizarre logic, they ended up assigning this to two different teams. One of those teams ended up coming out with XCOM Long War, which would be One Vision, and then the other came out with Bloodborne, which would be Reborn there. Where they technically both created amazing things, but what the fuck, they went in totally different directions. So, I mean, like, if there was a way to marry these two concepts, as I understand when you're into this whole thing, nobody's figured out a way to do that yet, it would be the greatest freaking thing ever made. But as it stands, I know personally, it just depends on where I'm sitting. Like, when I come home, I want to play some Reborn. When I'm out and about or at work or something, I'm playing Reborn or playing One Vision on my Vita. And, yeah, there really should be no competition between the two, because as I mentioned earlier, this all comes down to just a... to a case of whatever you're feeling for that particular playthrough. This game is best played over and over and over, trying for a different team every time, trying for something different every time. One playthrough will give you an experience, but it won't give you the whole experience by far. So, like, right now, I know I'm trying to play through a Iron Man run of One Vision, attempting to reintroduce myself to every one of the classes to get back to doing Know Your Unit type videos for that one. And then in Reborn, I'm trying to go and finish off the collection log there. Though, that being said, I was a little bit annoyed recently that So, normally I have the chariot button, the time reset button. I normally have that unbound, and I went and ended up redoing my settings when trying to fix a glitch from a mod a little bit ago. And, yeah, then I forgot that was there, and so I'd set my Steam Deck down on the bed, and it had opened up the chariot menu. Apparently the cat must have pressed some buttons or something at some point, but yeah, that ended up counting as the one and only chariot usage for this file after hundreds of hours. I just saved over and totally forgot. Anyway, whatever. It doesn't do anything in this one, so that's fine. Okay, so let's go ahead and wrap this up a little bit. Content-wise, what's the difference between them? Okay. And actually, for that matter, which one should I start with? Okay, from like 99 out of 100 people, I would recommend starting with Reborn. Why? It's not a content thing with these games. They are both obscene with the amount of content that they have. However, when it comes to Reborn, did I just say it? Okay, I think I was saying to start with Reborn. That's the one that I meant to say it. editing me, hopefully remember to fix that if I said it wrong. Anyway, the reason for this is entirely because it will color your experience of the whole thing. The voice acting is really damn good. The fact that it's stopping to have you watch those cutscenes and understand what's going on is really darn snazzy. The fact that they actually did all those cutscenes justice, the fact that it's generally easier to understand, the fact that many skills that generally were still considered useless in the PSP version actually got a chance to shine here may give you a better appreciation over why they might be good in One Vision. So I typically would recommend starting with Reborn. Go support the series a little bit. You may have noticed in reviews there were many older folks that got upset over this, that, or the other assumed random nonsense. Dude, this remake is frickin' amazing. Take it from a guy who's probably got tens of thousands of hours into it at this point. Not in this version, I just mean like this game in general across its various different versions. I might be a little bit nuts about this game. Anyway, but yeah, I would generally recommend starting with Reborn because that voice acting, like, I still hear that voice acting when I play One Vision. Like, when it comes to those little counter options, the team builds across those two different versions follow the same pattern of similar but different in both situations. Like, for example, in One Vision, you might go ahead and use a Terenius cudgel build because you want to make a really evasive parry guy. Over in Reborn, though, you might use a cudgel build because you want to create a ranged sleep spammer. Like, let's say you wanted to create a skirmisher build in One Vision, you might potentially go for a, like sword and bow kind of a rogue unit, potentially going and supporting them with some defense reducing dragon or something. Whereas if you wanted to create a skirmisher unit in Reborn, it might be along the lines of using a beast tamer with an axe and elemental shortbow to give them both a parry and counter option, because your weapons affect your other skills. Essentially the build options, while technically you're still doing, melee weapon plus ranged weapon, they have entirely different contexts. In the case of One Vision, it's because it's a unit that can harass well, that it can distract healing, can apply debuffs in very particular locations, and move out of the way quickly. Whereas in Reborn, the context is more along the lines of the finishers that they have will be a lot more useful coming off of a lighter weapon, potentially when combined with a melee weapon, or in other cases, might be something that allows you to exploit defense breaks off of your Terenius or something. There's basically aspects in both directions that make them really good to play. Now, that being said, if you're in a situation where you're like, okay, I only have my phone, I can't figure out how Switch emulation works, yeah, go ahead and start off with One Vision. It's freaking amazing. Just bear in mind that it was built with the assumption that you're paying attention to every little detail along the way. So, expect to need to do some reading along the way. Just like pay attention to stuff is what I'm getting at. And expect that there's going to be a mechanic behind every corner. That's the thing with this game. Every single frickin' little tiny thing has another mechanic behind it, has another reason why it's happening. If at any point you're thinking that something just doesn't make sense, realistically, there's probably a mechanic behind it. Probably the most infamous of which is like, oh, I can't recruit this guy under everything. This game must be bugged. Are they petrified? Are they charmed? Are they silenced? Are they asleep? Is their mental faculty in correct operating condition to be able to hold a conversation? If not, then they can't be recruited. Which is just kind of funny. But yeah, so there's that kind of stuff. But again, the focuses are entirely different on both of these. You do have a lot of new tools that are added in the One Vision version, though. That, like in many cases, those new strategic tools are one of those things that make that version so fun. But then you also have so much quality of life in Reborn that, again, the two become incomparable. Like, well, I want to have my grappling hook arm guards. I want to have my Captain America shield. I want to have this other shield that's deflecting magic. I want to have this parrying dagger in my offhand or something. Maybe I just want to run parrying dagger plus shield or something. Like, there's all of these little, again, wait, I apologize if my nose sounds funny. Our allergy season has decided to show up yet again. Michigan just has nonstop. So what's also funny? Another one of those things that makes it just hard to compare these two. It's like, technically speaking, we have a case where, okay, if we look at Reborn, you'll notice that there were a bunch of drops with golden boxes there. And this takes us to the fact that both of these versions ended up redoing the entire fucking map, and I mean like literally every single map from every single zone, from every single timeline, from everything. They both redid them to suit their own mechanics. Yes, Rakes, the One Vision guy, is capable of keeping up with an entire dev team. The dude is a frickin' god. Anyway, let's go ahead and continue on here. So they both ended up redoing everything in entirely different ways. In the case of Reborn, they were trying to create a situation where people would want to go and experience these zones over and over and over and over and over and over again. So you'll notice where like enemy units are coming in specifically not using ranged finishers, which is something they used to do all the time in PSP, in order to make them a more fun thing to fight against, whereas, you know, boss enemies are made a bit tougher. You'll notice that there's going to be a lot of cases where drops are a bit more random. Like previously, the Zephyros Spear is an item that's required to unlock a side event in the post-game that you realistically are never going to find on accident, but it dropped from one enemy that was in a complete, like, it dropped from one enemy, basically, on one map in one post-game area that didn't even spawn a good bit of the time, which meant that finding it on accident was pretty unlikely. This time around, you can potentially get 3 of them from the same fight. There's a lot more availability for a lot of those endgame items with interesting properties to them. You can upgrade your equipment by combining, you know, these different relic versions together. Like the baseline version will realistically be all you need, but then you just get better and better versions as time goes on and you collect more of them. Whereas the One Vision version was basically to make them stronger from the get-go, but they are a guaranteed drop from a guy that's usually guaranteed to spawn, as long as and hopefully they will drop the item bag. There is still a chance that they can drop cards, from what I understand, instead, but still, this vastly fixed the old PSP issue of getting to past the post-game and everything else, and then realizing you were basically running around with no post-game items. For some reason, they made them incredibly rare in the PSP version. It was weird. Anyway, it's like right there, there's an entire section of Palace of the Dead that was reworked to just drop a absolute ton of various crafting books. And that feels really darn good. Feels really good to have them there. Feels good to be able to clear through that area and pretty consistently get most of them. But this retains a feeling back from the original versions, where they wanted to give this feeling of almost like a roguelike, where you were getting random equipment. Sorry, one more interruption there. But they wanted to retain this feeling of getting completely random equipment. And in the case of One Vision, they wanted to make it more of a case where you consistently knew that you would get that thing over there. So, again, both versions work extremely well, both are equally valid, both feel incredible to fucking play, and still, there will be arguments between the two over which definitive version is more definitive. Realistically speaking, again, my personal take on this whole thing is just play both. You start off with Reborn, you get the really good visuals and voice acting and everything else, and the quality of life stuff, and then you go back to One Vision when you want a different rule set. And then other times, maybe you go back to the PSP version because you want a different rule set and also like to suffer. And maybe then you'll just feel like going and checking out the SNES version because you love when your save gets corrupted. And so then, again, it's just different rule sets for the same universe, and every time you're playing through, it's creating a new story. It's creating a new, it's a new memory to kind of go back and look through your old save files. Like, yeah, you know what, I remember this weird frickin' run over here where I just decided to hire every random dude named Philip for some reason. It turns out I wasn't the only one who did that. It wasn't for Philip. I think they were going for Martins or something. I forget. If you're here, let me know what name that was. I totally forgot by now. But just everybody will eventually start to do some weird roleplay thing for their save files, and it's really darn fun. And I should mention also, when it comes to those unique moments, there's specific stuff that each version will be, again, specifically able to do. Like, let's say, over in Reborn's case, it feels really good to set your unit up for a crit build, pick up a crit card, use a ranged finishing move to go, like, crit a guy into another guy that's able to pincer him to finish him off. That stuff feels absolutely amazing, especially when it's off of a wall. Those are especially satisfying. Like, literally throw a guy off a wall into yet another attack. It feels so good. I remember on launch day, I had put out a video that was showing, like, here's 3 spear pincer attacks on the same guy. The link to buy is in the description. Because it's just like, yeah, that just feels good. Anyway, whereas in Reborn, or not in Reborn, in One Vision, I will totally never get those confused. You'll have those moments where, yeah, it just feels incredibly good to drop every single debuff on the list on one guy, and then potentially go and crit them with your throwing tomahawks or something in order to go get them set up for, let's say, some other guy to go finish him off with, let's say or to go have your your Dragonborn go and yell them off a cliff or something, like there's just things that each version can do. It's really not something that you can compare directly. As I was mentioning before, would you ever compare XCOM, Long War, and Bloodborne? Like, no, they're totally different experiences. There is no, like, you can't just say one is objectively freaking better than the other, because they're doing different things. But anyway, so yeah, completely different mentalities between them. But yeah, I would honestly, whichever one you start off with, it's up to you. If you heard all of this and you're like, man, I really want to do my Captain America shield thing, then yeah, go ahead and go for One Vision. If you want to start off with the good voice acting and the better game flow and stuff like that, then yeah, go ahead and go for Reborn there. Again, part of the reason that I recommend Reborn over and over and over is just because it flows so damn well. I forget if I explained this earlier because I'm a rambling moron, but earlier I was trying to say that this music that's in the background, it's one of my most nostalgic tracks growing up. Because it's a theme I've always associated with something having a good rhythm. And I regularly found myself listening to this while playing Reborn, and it's like, yeah, this just goes exactly on every beat. Like, this is just going and going and going. Like, right there, the reason that he's going for his Brimstone Hail over there while currently trying to play both these games on AI is because both of those guys were an ice element. His water element doesn't help much, but that fire element off that finisher matters. And, like, those elemental colored finishers off the finishers in Reborn, they matter a ton. The debuffs, they matter a ton. In One Vision's case, all of the debuffs on those finishers became guaranteed, and they were also given different ranges. Both of them added different ranges for finishers. Both of them added different reasons to use the entire finisher list at once, in totally different ways. They both added reasons to think about your item loadouts more, but they both did it in completely different ways. Reborn had you equip 4 items on your people, whereas One Vision had you narrow down the list of item specializations to 2 instead of 4. This is a good thing. I know it sounds like a boil down, it's a good thing. Anyway, and then they added certain classes that are item specialists, like Warlocks are able to just brew their own healing items, MP items, TP items, whatever else is part of their skill list. Whereas Warlocks and Rune Fencers are able to throw items innately, but everyone else can equip a throwing item just thing in their offhand, like a lobbing hand. Whereas in Reborn's case, they made it so that the Beast Tamer and the Fusilier are the ones that are able to throw. Actually, technically, Beast Tamer, Fusilier, Lord, and Ranger. But then at the same time, they took... This is where we take a quick look at thrown weapons, where, like, in One Vision, they were changed, so it's like, okay, the PSP version had them as a consumable ammo-using item that would effectively... just cost a ton of money to use, but it would give you a slight attack bonus and would only be one-handed. And then at the same time, they didn't quite finish them in the PSP version. So One Vision comes along and they're like, okay, what if we just made them into an official weapon category? We merged them into one of the functional weapon categories. So now they have finishers. They no longer take ammunition to use. But in order to retain that feeling of being heavy, they will be very heavy to equip. And additionally, if they target a unit and hit them, they may potentially hobble them, they may potentially slow them down. And that's really, really good. That's a really smart idea on how to handle it. So, and then at the same time, in Reborn's case, here, let me go back to show it. Here, let me just show them side by side. I think I'm this guy. There we go. It's like right here. where, like, let's say the tomahawk, in order to equip it, it's a weight of 10, whereas like a fist weapon would be 3. Recovery time for a fist would be 8. For this one, it would be 28, because it's a heavy throwing axe. But then at the same time, it has a chance to hobble the unit on hit, and it's going to be a pretty hefty hitter. Whereas in Reborn's case, they again took a look at that exact same system and decided to take a different approach with it, where they took out those particular throwing weapons, but they ended up changing it to where there's essentially shot grenades. These were another non-functional item back in PSP, but they gave them a lot more context, where now suddenly they interacted with your weapon skill. They could be used by anybody without a respective skill for it, and every class could use them in a different way. Like, for example, this Valkyrie isn't very good when it comes to attacking stuff at a direct diagonal. She keeps one shot grenade on her for the purpose of attacking diagonally. Whereas if we go over to one of the Beast Tamers over here, let me go find one of them. In his particular case, he's got this Lobber skill, which allows him to throw these at long range, and he equips a thing that allows him to over-level his bow skill in order to give them more damage. Okay, that's pretty darn handy. But then at the same time, we have this guy over here, and apparently I need to go to the store to buy more of these. Where in his particular case, he's also over-leveling his weapon skill, but he's equipping another skill that removes 90% of damage. Meaning in his particular case, the context changes to where he can just punch somebody using these while taking basically no damage himself. So essentially, with each new mechanic that we look at, we just see that they went and they explored them in a different direction entirely, and it just feels so good to have multiple different rule sets for the same frickin' game. Like, bear in mind, these are technically using the same engine, more or less. Reborn retooled some stuff so that you have, autosaves and whatnot. You might have been able to tell in the background. They added more backgrounds. Like, I really, 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 really love what they did with the backgrounds. And let's go ahead and start off a fight real quick just to show this before I start wrapping it up here. Where they had changed it so that whereas in PSP and One Vision there, the backgrounds are typically like a sky blue kind of color. They had changed it so that when you're going through these maps, they're actually remade using in-game assets and things like that. I don't think we're going to see that much here. Actually, this map might be a terrible example of it. One quick second here. Let me look around and see if it'll show it here. Trying to interrupt the turn right now. But you can partially see it right here. But what's interesting is that there were so many little details that kind of flew under the radar here. I don't know how much of this you can tell, but effectively they remade the sort of chasm from some of the artwork using the in-game tile sets, then threw a fog over it so that it would be kind of hard to tell what's going on there. And whenever you're indoors, this artwork in the background becomes darker. So like you'll see when you're on castle maps and stuff, you'll see the town outside remade using the in-game assets, but then when they're outside, you'll see them all lit up and bright because, hey, you can see it right over there instead of being across from the wall there. Everything about Reborn is about setting the mood, Like the mood, the speed, the flow. I've seen more people get into this game than ever before with this version, not just because it came out on something like the Switch, but just because there finally was this constant flow, this constant feeling of progression, not in the MMO kind of old 2000 sense like many of us are used to, grinding skills up and improving your character sheets and whatever else, but more of a feeling of you are climbing that mountain, you are kicking ass and taking names on your way up there, and every time you're playing through, you're seeing new stuff, and this new added speed let people finally experience that. Multiple playthroughs of finally experiencing how the story was adapting to the things they did. That it was more than just simply a combat system, Anyway, so this is getting a little bit long here, but that's kind of what we're looking at here. If you're looking to get into these for the first time, just know that, again, this is more of a Fallout or Mass Effect type situation. The main focus of these games is primarily the story that they tell, but when it comes to the two different versions, you'll technically have more knobs and features in One Vision, but the quality of life and flow and pacing is absolutely god tier in Reborn. So, and again, that's not to downplay any kind of flow that One Vision has in its own way. That's the thing, they're completely freaking incomparable. I would just recommend starting with Reborn entirely because it will color the experience. It will, like, you will hear that voice acting when you're going through and playing through these versions. You'll see, essentially get a better understanding for why some of the changes are how they are in, like One Vision or the PSP version or whatever else, because everything was done with a lot of heart. There was, frankly, a lot of Reborn was designed in a way that was kind of expected to be thankless. I'm assuming they kind of just understood that realistically, this series has always been so niche that they're just going to get a bunch of criticism and get very little praise. So I'm just assuming they kind of had that, like, beat down husband feeling when it came to designing it. Of like, we're going to do our best. Somebody will appreciate this down the line. For now, we'll just take our licks and our mixed Steam reviews and just go relax, I guess. But yeah. In the case of something like One Vision, though, obviously the community is already invested. We're already there, so it's like, yeah, okay, we're gonna love the hell out of that because nobody asked. it's being made as technically a labor of love in both situations. Just one had corporate backing, and obviously there's always going to be the subset of folks that are like, oh no, somebody made money off it, kill it. So we've got all sorts of that kind of stuff going on. But anyway, I hope this was helpful in, helping come to a decision or what have you. Again, you can't go wrong. I know I've ended this video like 8 times. You know how this goes around this channel. This is just how we do it. I always come up with something else to say at the last second. Anyway, so thank you guys for stopping by and putting up with this crazy ramble, and I hope this was helpful for you. All right, and if you wouldn't mind, look, we got to do the whole YouTube thing, the whole press the like buttons or subscribe buttons. I don't actually know if that crap does anything. Apparently you're supposed to say it, and it feels dirty to say. It makes it feel like an asshole, but, supposedly that's how channels exist for a longer time. So yeah, that's about that. Anyway, y'all have a good one. Thank you again, and take care.